I think one of the problems with a group such as the LGBT movement, well, a group, because isn't it like LGBTQ plus now? It's probably suffering from overpopulation, perhaps, because it just keeps getting bigger and bigger, and the more people that they add to it, I think, just causes way more friction, because they haven't all got the same. It's kind of like we're all oppressed in certain ways. We're all sort of not exactly fitting into society just yet. So therefore, we all have, a shared experience, a shared common goals, but all those experiences aren't exactly the same. Being trans isn't quite as acceptable as being gay, for sure, because homosexuality has has been legal for like 50 years now. It's half a century. And not that being trans was, I'm not sure about what the laws were about being trans over the decades, but it wasn't quite as acceptable as being gay. I'd definitely say that, just from memory. So I don't think they all have the same problems and the same. I don't think they're all quite the same, but you can understand why you would create the group. Like more people together. The bigger the group, the more people. Strength in numbers. It's the strength in numbers thing. But when certain people feel that certain other groups of people shouldn't be joining their group, it becomes a problem. And this is what is happening now. And I think it was inevitable, because not everyone feels the same way. Such is life. That's not a song I made up at all. Didn't it start off as LGB? I'm pretty sure, and then the T, then the Q, then the plus, and then and now even I've heard about people from NAMBLA, people that want kitty kissing rights. Kitty kisses want rights. They've been trying to sort of muscle in. I've seen some stuff about that, about them trying to join, but they've kind of been told where to go, which is good. But but it just seems like they have a similar sort of thought, as in, we'll join this group and then we can be more protected. Because look, just because you're gay doesn't mean that you have a strong affinity to someone that is transsexual or transgender, or whatever you're supposed to say these days. Who cares? It's all the same thing. It doesn't, and a trans person doesn't necessarily have to agree with homosexuality. I know, crazy, isn't it? But it is a thing, because it's when people are surprised. You go, oh really? You're not into that? No, I don't. Or when, say, a lesbian doesn't like bisexual girls. That's a thing. There's all things out there. People are individuals. And maybe, I think being trans is totally different to being gay. So I don't have... it's just because it's different, and it does involve sexuality, in a way, but it's not your sexual preference, it's the preference of who you are as a gender. So it's different, but it's kind of all been bunched together. Like I said, because they all think they're having the same problems, but perhaps they are not. And perhaps it's been an uneasy alliance all along. I don't know. You see similar things going on in the feminist movement. We have TERFs, and then the other types of feminists, feminists who don't want transitioned men coming into their world. And I can understand that too. I understand all of it. I can listen to everyone's opinion, going, yeah, I get you. But it's sort of thing of if you're gay and you don't want trans people in your group, sharing your this thing that you're part of that's very important to you. And as soon as that happens, you sort of get vilified for it. But everyone, like, you know, everyone can be different. You know, everyone can have a different opinion. So it says here, if London needs a separate trans pride, what does that say about LGBT solidarity? That maybe the pride of being trans, maybe it should have its own thing anyway. Maybe that would be a good thing because that's its own thing. Instead of just being lumped in with a bunch of other people, maybe the spotlight will be more focused on that group of people who are probably maybe they're overlooked in a certain way. I don't know. Any protests at last year's Pride in London have led to a breakaway event. It could spark much needed change. Pride in London is one day of the year that the city feels like it belongs to the LGBTQ plus people, which was why I was so confused, embarrassed and alarmed when a small group of lesbians disrupted last year's event with a protest against the inclusion of trans people. Their banners read, "Trans activism erases lesbians." Now what you could say there is, you know, you got a bunch of lesbians who are like, we're kind of taking the spotlight away from our cause, you know. And there's many different reasons why they'd feel that way. It's not necessarily because they're, you know, massive attention seekers. There's loads of different reasons why they could feel that way. Not necessarily because of bad reasons. It's probably because they feel like, if you feel like your rights haven't quite been recognised the way they should be yet, and then you have a distraction in your group that would be trans, then maybe that's maybe that's why you'd feel that way. Just saying. Pride in London quickly condemned the protest, but as a lesbian and a feminist, and a really, really fun person, I worried that people would think these protesters represented me. A bit like how certain men get. Certain men's behaviour just represents all men. Yeah. I worry that... anyway, more than that, I worried about how it all left trans people feeling. Perhaps a year later we have a clear answer. Plans for the London Trans Pride have been announced, due to take place on the 14th of September. The event will celebrate and centre trans and gender non-conforming people. There will be daytime family-friendly events such as panel discussions and Zine making, right, as well as stalls from trans charities and businesses, followed later by an after party with trans musicians, performers and DJs. The idea was sparked by last year's anti-trans protests, say its organisers, performer and promoter Finn Love, and artist and activist Lucia Blake. Love says they felt disappointed and upset, not only because the protest took place, but because Pride's reaction was not strong enough. That really reflects the cis dominance of London Pride. Oh, here we go. It's an attack on people who just have regular genders, as I perceive it. If there were trans people calling the shots, it wouldn't have happened in that way. And if those protesters were coming out against gay people, the reaction wouldn't have been the same. But people value gay rights more than trans rights. That's a fact. It might be a case, but probably because, like I said, like, gay rights have been recognised for longer. The acceptance of trans people in such a mainstream way is very new. Like, it's pretty new. You know, it's only 10 years ago that we had that show, There's Something About Miriam. You know what I mean? It's you know, you wouldn't have had a show about, you know, exploiting homosexuality in such a way in the last 20 years or so. Like, I swear down. But and then it's sort of tit for tat, and again it's sort of boiling down to an oppression Olympics type thing, you know, who should have the most rights. When I heard about the event, my first reaction was, the more prides, the better. Yeah, why not? But there are risks. When I travelled across Europe recently for my book, Queer Intentions, I don't actually mind that title. I saw the difficulties of having multiple prides. In Berlin, the celebration has splintered into 4 different events, all happening over 24 hours, making it hard to work out which to go to. Well, look, go to the one that represents you, innit? And if loads of them represent you, then bloody hell, you've got too much going on, haven't you? In Belgrade, where there are 2 prides, there seemed to be a great deal of animosity and infighting between the organisers. London would ideally be like Amsterdam, where a single umbrella pride hosts hundreds of mini events under one banner, making proceedings feel cohesive and accessible, giving everyone their moment in the spotlight, melding party with protest. Love sees London Trans Pride as an addition to Pride in London, not a rival, part of the reason it is slated for September. Still, I wonder if it would be necessary in the first place, if Pride in London made trans people feel sufficiently welcome. This year marks the 50 years since the Stonewall riots, the LGBTQ plus uprising in New York. Stonewall is why we have Pride, and crucially, it was led by trans women, mostly trans women of colour. We always have to drop that in there. You know, the trans women. Yes, trans women of colour. Love me, like me, like me. Michael Salter Church, co-chair of Pride in London, says naturally trans groups will only ever be part of the overall when you've got 600 groups making up the parade. However, this year he promises Pride will be doing more for trans people. After last year's protests, the organisers, made up of 150 volunteers, held consultations with trans organisations and activists, as well as recruiting more trans volunteers. For 2019, they have implemented new security measures in collaboration with the police, and Salter Church assures me trans people will be more visible in both the marketing campaign and parade itself. They have also reached out to London Trans Pride to offer their support. We want to be independent, grassroots and DIY, Loves responds. We're resistant to corporate sponsorship and narratives. We're trying to be distinctly and deliberately different. However, Love concedes that consulting with bigger, more experienced events will be necessary for the safety of London Trans Pride in an increasing climate of transphobia. This security was my other thought when I heard about London Trans Pride. Much more pressing than the idea of our community might be fracturing. How can we ensure the safety of trans people who attend events like this? The very fact that we need to ask the question helps explain the desire for a separate trans pride in the first place. It could spark much needed change at a time when the T in LGBT always seems to come last, in more ways than one. I would just say, look, if they think that the lesbians protested consider that their rights are more important than trans rights, then if you want to highlight trans rights and highlight your right to exist, then I think having your own pride is a very good idea. And maybe you should separate, because you might not all share the same common ground. I think it's just because, otherwise eventually it's just going to be like, we're the weirdos. Like, do you know what I mean? It's like we're the different people that aren't the normative, and so many, how many people are going to join one group? Probably should have stayed lesbian and gays, and bisexuals can have their own little thing, and trans can have their own little thing. Just like maybe, they're all bounded. I think people were all bounded together, like back in the day, because of, that's the common thing they shared, was because of how they're ostracized and excluded from mainstream society. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they were all had the same. Do you know what I'm saying? That maybe they were an ill fit. They were just brought together because of certain things. And this happens a lot when groups sort of come together for a common cause, and they can splinter off eventually. I mean, this is a weird example, but like, look at the Iranian Revolution. Like all the imams, the religious leaders, came together with socialists, like these bunch of socialist radicals, to overthrow the monarchy. Then when they got into power, the Ayatollah and all his cronies murdered the socialists. See, when they had to be together, they were together. But then when they got their goals, there was conflicts going on there. So, if you are, you're sort of forced. It's kind of like you're forced together because of how society treats you. But then when society starts more accepting you, you're sort of starting to realise that maybe you're not your common goals, your common, the thing that brought you together is sort of unnecessary, is going away now. Like that bond, that original bond that you had, that thing that brought you together is no longer there. And so why are you still together? Because, and you may realize that no, we're very different, and perhaps we're not the best fit. Maybe that's why. There's lots of other examples. Go explore them.